When Arthur strolled into the Chicago courthouse clutching the hand of a 22-year-old Pilates instructor, he thought he was holding the keys to his new, wealthy life. He looked at his overweight, soon-to-be ex-wife with pure pity. He had absolutely no idea she was the CEO about to fire him. The air inside the Cook County family court was thick with the scent of floor wax and broken promises. Penelope Hayes sat quietly on a rigid wooden bench in the corridor of the 4th floor, her hands neatly folded in her lap. At 260 pounds, Penelope was a woman who took up space in a world that constantly demanded she shrink. For 15 years of marriage, her husband had been the loudest voice demanding that shrinkage. She wore a custom-tailored, deep navy suit. It was impeccable, woven from Italian wool, but she knew exactly what her husband would see when he looked at her, a failure. To Arthur, Penelope's weight was a personal insult, a glaring flaw in the pristine, socially climbing image he had tried to cultivate for himself. Down the hallway, the heavy oak double doors swung open. Penelope didn't need to look up to know he had arrived. She could hear the sharp, arrogant click of his designer leather shoes. Arthur Hayes walked with the exaggerated swagger of a man who believed he had finally won the lottery of life. He was tall, impeccably groomed, with a jawline he credited to good genetics and a ruthlessly expensive dermatologist. But what made Penelope's lawyer, Miranda Shaw, stiffen beside her wasn't Arthur's tailored charcoal suit. It was the woman clinging to his left arm. Her name was Chloe. She was 24, a fitness influencer with a spray tan and a dress that was entirely too short, too tight, and too vibrant for a Tuesday morning divorce hearing. Chloe was the physical antithesis of Penelope, a walking, talking trophy that Arthur had brought to court as a psychological weapon. "I cannot believe the audacity of this man," Miranda whispered, her voice laced with a lethal, quiet fury as she adjusted her glasses. "Bringing the mistress to the final settlement hearing? The judge is going to chew him alive." Penelope simply smiled, a small, barely perceptible upward tilt of her lips. "Let him, Miranda. Arthur always was a visual creature. He needs his audience. Let him have his stage." Out! Moke. As Arthur and Chloe approached, they didn't have the decency to sit on the opposite side of the wide corridor. Instead, Arthur stopped directly in front of Penelope, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. "Penelope," Arthur said, his tone dripping with a mixture of faux pity and blatant condescension, "I see you're still wearing that old navy thing. You know, with the settlement I'm offering today, you could afford a gym membership. Or at least a stylist." Chloe let out a high-pitched, breathy giggle, leaning her head against Arthur's shoulder. She looked Penelope up and down, her eyes lingering on Penelope's waistline with overt disgust. "Arthur told me you were letting yourself go, but wow," Chloe chirped, her voice echoing in the quiet hallway. "I actually have a discount code for a wellness and detox retreat in Tulum. You should totally use it. It works wonders for sluggish metabolisms." Penelope looked at the young girl. There was no hatred in Penelope's eyes, only a profound, oceanic calm that seemed to unnerve the younger woman. "Thank you, Chloe," Penelope said softly, her voice rich and steady. "But I assure you my metabolism is functioning exactly as it needs to, and my affairs are perfectly in order." Arthur scoffed, checking his gold Rolex watch. Penelope had bought him for their 10th anniversary, back when he was still struggling to get his footing in the corporate world. "Your affairs. Penelope, please, you spent the last decade baking sourdough and sitting behind a laptop in your sweatpants while I built a career. I'm the executive director at Kensington Global now. I'm in the major leagues. It's time you stopped dragging me down and accept the lump sum. It's more than fair for someone who contributed nothing but grocery bills to this marriage." Arthur's entire worldview was built on a monumental, catastrophic delusion. When they had met in college, Arthur had the charisma, but Penelope had the brains. When Arthur's first 3 startup attempts failed spectacularly, burning through his inheritances and leaving him in crippling debt, it was Penelope who quietly paid the mortgages. She told him she was doing freelance bookkeeping. In reality, Penelope was a savant in digital acquisitions and corporate restructuring. Working quietly from her home office, eating takeout and avoiding the shallow socialite parties Arthur craved, Penelope had built an absolute behemoth of an e-commerce and venture capital portfolio. She operated through a labyrinth of shell companies and proxy boards, primarily under the umbrella of Apex Horizon Holdings. She hid her wealth not out of malice, but because Arthur's fragile ego couldn't handle a wife who earned more than him. She had spent a decade shrinking her presence so Arthur could feel like a giant, but when Arthur handed her divorce papers 6 months ago, citing irreconcilable differences in lifestyle and physical standards, and immediately moved Chloe into a luxury penthouse, Penelope's protective instincts fame evaporated. "We'll see what Judge Campbell thinks is fair, Arthur," Penelope replied, her tone perfectly even. The bailiff opened the doors to courtroom 402. Hayes versus Hayes. All parties, please enter. Arthur puffed at his chest, gave Chloe a triumphant kiss on the cheek, and strode into the courtroom. He was a man marching confidently toward what he believed was his ultimate victory, utterly oblivious to the landmines buried beneath his feet. Courtroom 402 was bathed in harsh fluorescent light, illuminating the stark reality of the proceedings. Judge Leonard Campbell, the no-nonsense jurist with a reputation for a short temper, peered over his reading glasses as the parties took their seats. Arthur sat tall at the petitioner's table beside his attorney, a notoriously aggressive and sleazy lawyer named David Caldwell. Behind them in the gallery, Chloe sat scrolling on her phone, occasionally looking up to blow Arthur a kiss. "All right, let's get this over with," Judge Campbell grumbled, flipping through the massive file on his desk. "We are here for the final asset division and spousal support ruling in the dissolution of the marriage between Arthur and Penelope Hayes. Mr. Caldwell, your client is the petitioner. You may proceed." David Caldwell stood, buttoning his suit jacket. "Thank you, Your Honor. We are here today to request a clean, equitable break. My client, Mr. Hayes, has recently secured a highly lucrative career-defining position as the Senior Executive Director at Kensington Global, a premier venture capital firm. His new base salary, coupled with his signing bonus and stock options, pushes his annual compensation well over the $2 million mark." Arthur sat back, a smug, self-satisfied grin plastered across his face. He glanced over at Penelope, waiting for her to look devastated by the sheer magnitude of his success. She didn't. She was carefully taking notes on a yellow legal pad. "Because of this sudden increase in my client's wealth, which occurred after the separation filing," Caldwell continued, "the respondent, Mrs. Hayes, is now demanding an exorbitant and entirely unjustified percentage of his future earnings in permanent spousal support. Your Honor, Mrs. Hayes has not held a traditional job in 12 years. She has chosen a sedentary lifestyle. She has not contributed to Mr. Propiet's say. Hayes's professional networking, she has refused to attend corporate functions, and frankly, her refusal to maintain a lifestyle commensurate with my client's public image has been an active hindrance to his career." Judge Campbell frowned, his eyes darting to Penelope. "Mr. Caldwell, are you asserting that a spouse's physical appearance or social habits negate their right to marital assets?" "I am asserting, Your Honor, that this marriage was a one-way street," Caldwell countered smoothly. "Mr. Hayes generated the income. Mr. Hayes drove the ambition. We are offering Mrs. Hayes a generous one-time lump sum of $400,000. This is more than enough for her to start over, perhaps invest in her health and live a quiet life. To grant her a percentage of Kensington Global's money would be a gross miscarriage of justice. She had no hand in building the man who earned that contract." "I see," Judge Campbell said dryly. He turned to the defense table. "Miss Shaw. Your response?" Miranda Shaw stood up slowly. She possessed a predatory grace, her eyes locked onto Arthur with the intensity of a hawk spotting a field mouse. Your Honor, we reject the petitioner's narrative entirely. Furthermore, we reject the $400,000 settlement offer. In fact, we are not asking for a single penny of Mr. Hayes' new salary at Kensington Global. A ripple of shock went through the courtroom. Arthur's smug grin faltered for a fraction of a second before returning, wider than ever. He leaned over to Caldwell and whispered loudly, "She finally realized she has no leverage. She's giving up." In the gallery, Chloe let out a relieved, audible sigh. "You're waiving spousal support, Ms. Sure?" Judge Campbell asked, raising an eyebrow. "Make sure your client understands the finality of that decision." "My client understands perfectly, Your Honor," Miranda said, pacing slowly in front of Penelope's table. "However, before we sign the final waivers, we need to address a few matters regarding the full disclosure of assets, and specifically the nature of Mr. Prana. Hayes' new employment. We would like to call Mr. Mather." Hayes to the stand. Arthur rolled his eyes, but Caldwell nodded. "No objection, Your Honor. My client has nothing to hide." Arthur strutted to the witness stand, taking the oath with a theatrical raise of his right hand. He settled into the chair, adjusting his tie and offering the judge a charming, winning smile. "Mr. Hayes," Miranda began, stepping up to the podium, "congratulations on your new role at Kensington Global. It's quite the leap from your previous middle management position." "Thank you," Arthur said, smoothly. "It took years of grinding, networking, and maintaining a high standard of personal excellence to get here. Hard work pays off." "Indeed it does," Miranda noted. "You signed this contract 3 weeks ago, correct?" "A 5-year guarantee, yes. It's a very ironclad agreement. They value my specific vision for corporate restructuring, and you consider yourself a thorough businessman, Mr. Hayes. You read the fine print of the contracts you sign." "Of course," Arthur scoffed. "I don't sign anything blindly. My legal team reviewed it extensively." Miranda pulled a thick, bound document from her briefcase and handed it to the bailiff, who passed it to Arthur. "I direct your attention to page 42 of your employment contract, Mr. Hayes, specifically Section H, Clause B. Could you read the heading of that clause for the court?" Arthur adjusted his posture, looking mildly annoyed. He flipped through the pages. "It says, Parent Company Oversight and Morality Clause." "Excellent. And are you aware that Kensington Global is not an independent entity, but rather a recently acquired subsidiary?" Arthur waved his hand dismissively. Yes. Kensington was bought out in a massive private equity acquisition 2 months ago by a larger holding company. That's why there was an opening for an executive director. The new owners cleared out the old dead weight. They wanted fresh, dynamic, aggressive leadership. They wanted me. And did you, with all your thorough business acumen, happen to check the name of the holding company that now owns your contract, pays your salary, and holds the right to terminate you at their sole discretion? Arthur hesitated. For the first time that morning, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his polished features. It was a private conglomerate. Apex something, Horizon. Apex Horizon Holdings. It's an incredibly secretive fund. Even the recruiters didn't have direct contact with the CEO. "Apex Horizon Holdings," Miranda repeated, her voice echoing off the wood-paneled walls. "That is correct. A multi-billion-dollar fund known for its ruthless efficiency and zero-tolerance policy for corporate embarrassment." Miranda turned back to her table and picked up a single sheet of paper. It bore an embossed gold-foiled seal at the top. "Your Honor," Miranda said, turning to Judge Campbell, "I'd like to submit Defense Exhibit D into evidence. It is the corporate registration list of primary shareholders in the Articles of Incorporation for Apex Horizon Holdings, updated and verified as of yesterday." Judge Campbell took the paper from the bailiff. He put on his reading glasses. The courtroom was dead silent. The only sound was the ticking of the wall clock and the rustle of the judge turning the page. Judge Campbell's eyes widened. He looked up, staring directly at Penelope, who sat perfectly still, her hands still neatly folded over her stomach. The judge then looked at Arthur, his expression shifting from boredom to sheer, unadulterated astonishment. "Mr. Passat, Mr. Balneary Caldwell," Judge Campbell said, his voice suddenly very grave. "Have you seen this document?" "No, Your Honor. Defense counsel ambushed us with this." "I object to its relevance," Caldwell barked, standing up. "Overruled. You might want to come look at this, Counselor. Because if I'm reading this correctly—" Judge Campbell paused, taking a deep breath. "The sole owner, the founding CEO, and the majority shareholder holding 98% of the voting rights for Apex Horizon Holdings is Penelope Hayes." A heavy, suffocating silence dropped over courtroom 402 like a lead weight. Arthur's mouth fell open. He stared at the judge, then at Caldwell, and finally his eyes locked onto his overweight, discarded wife. Penelope didn't gloat. She didn't sneer. She simply looked back at him with the cool, detached expression of an employer evaluating a very, very, very poor investment. The silence in courtroom 402 was so absolute it felt as though the air had been entirely vacuumed from the room. David Caldwell, a lawyer whose entire career was built on aggressive bluffing, took the gold-foiled document from the bailiff. His eyes scanned the heavy, formal text. He looked at the state certification, the Delaware corporate registry seals, and the indisputable, legally binding list of executive shareholders. Caldwell's naturally flushed face drained of all color, taking on the pallor of a dead man. "Mr. Caldwell," Judge Campbell said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register, "I strongly suggest you advise your client to sit down, close his mouth, and remain very, very quiet." But Arthur Hayes was incapable of quiet. The gears in his head were grinding, trying to process a reality that fundamentally shattered his entire worldview. He pointed a trembling, manicured finger at his wife. "This is a joke, a fabrication." Arthur sputtered, his voice cracking as he looked from the judge to his lawyer. "Look at her, Your Honor. Does she look like a billionaire CEO? She spends her weekends watching cooking shows. She hasn't seen the inside of a gym in a decade. She's lazy, she's completely unmotivated, and she is certainly not the head of a private equity firm. This is some sort of fraudulent revenge stunt." "Mr. Hayes," Judge Campbell roared, slamming his gavel down so hard the sound cracked like a rifle shot. "You will show respect in my courtroom, or I will have you thrown in a holding cell for contempt. And frankly, given the verified, authenticated state documents currently sitting on my desk, you are actively insulting the woman who owns the very company that employs you." Arthur turned to his lawyer, desperate for a lifeline. "David, do something. Object." "She's lying. Even if she did somehow build a company while sitting on the couch, half of it is mine. We've been married for 15 years. We live in an equitable distribution state. If she's worth billions, I'm entitled to half of that portfolio. I want half of Apex Horizon." Miranda Shaw didn't even blink. She walked calmly back to her desk and picked up a slender manila folder. "I'm afraid that won't be possible, Mr. Hayes," Miranda said, her voice dripping with clinical precision. "Your Honor, I direct the court's attention to Defense Exhibit E, a post-nuptial agreement drafted and executed in October of 2019. Arthur physically recoiled. "The post-nup? But I had that drafted." "Indeed you did, Arthur," Penelope spoke up. It was the first time she had addressed him directly since the hearing began. Her voice was not angry. It was steeped in a terrifying, absolute calm. "Do you remember why you forced me to sign it?" Arthur swallowed hard, his throat suddenly bone dry. In the gallery, Chloe had stopped scrolling on her phone. She was sitting up straight, her heavily glossed lips parted in confusion as she watched her golden goose begin to sweat. "In 2019, Miranda explained to the judge, Mr. Hayes was attempting to launch his third startup, a luxury lifestyle app that ultimately failed. At the time, he was terrified that his wife's failing freelance bookkeeping business would accrue debt that he would be held liable for. He demanded a post-nuptial agreement to completely sever their financial liabilities. In this heavily ironclad document, drafted by his own attorneys, Mr. Hayes explicitly waived any and all current or future rights, equity, or interest in Mrs. Hayes' business listed at the time as Apex Digital Consulting, which later incorporated into Apex Horizon Holdings. Miranda held up the signature page. He demanded absolute financial separation to protect his wealth from her liabilities. He legally walled himself off from her empire, all because he thought she was a failure. Judge Campbell looked at the post-nuptial agreement, then looked at Arthur with an expression of sheer, unadulterated pity. You signed away your rights to a multi-billion-dollar corporate empire because you wanted to protect a startup that went bankrupt 6 months later. I was deceived, Arthur shouted, his composure completely disintegrating. She hid the true value from me. That invalidates the agreement. There was no dissection, Penelope said softly. The financial disclosures attached to that very post-nup clearly stated my corporate assets were valued at over $80 million at the time. You just didn't read them, Arthur. You told me, and I quote, "I don't care about your little spreadsheets, Penelope. Just sign the paper so your dead weight doesn't sink my ship." You were so blinded by your own arrogance, so convinced of my inferiority that you didn't even bother to read the disclosures your own lawyers prepared. Caldwell buried his face in his hands. It was the ultimate legal suicide. Arthur had hung himself with his own rope. But that brings us to the present day, Miranda continued, moving in for the kill. Your Honor, Mr. Mans Hayes has spent the last 20 minutes boasting about his lucrative new contract at Kensington Global, an Apex Horizon subsidiary. He stated he is making over $2 million a year. He used this position to justify offering my client a paltry $400,000 settlement while simultaneously flaunting his mistress in a court of law. Miranda turned to the gallery and gestured toward the double doors. Outside this courtroom stands Gregory Harrison, the global head of human resources for Apex Horizon. He is waiting with a document of his own. Arthur's eyes darted to the doors, real panic finally setting in. What document? As the majority shareholder and acting CEO of the parent company, my client has executive oversight, Miranda explained. Under Section 8, Clause B of your Kensington Global contract, the Morality and Public Standing Clause, the parent company reserves the right to immediately terminate any executive whose public behavior brings severe disrepute, scandal, or embarrassment to the corporate brand. Miranda walked right up to the petitioner's table, leaning in close to Arthur. Bringing your 24-year-old mistress to a public divorce hearing to humiliate your wife, who happens to be the CEO of the conglomerate that owns your firm, is the very definition of corporate embarrassment. Penelope stood up. She smoothed the front of her navy suit, standing tall at 260 pounds of pure, unshakable power. She looked at the man who had spent a decade making her feel small, making her feel ugly, and making her feel worthless. Arthur, Penelope said, her voice echoing with the weight of absolute authority. You are officially terminated from Kensington Global, effective immediately. For cause. Your signing bonus will be clawed back, your stock options are voided, and you will not receive a single penny of severance. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the traffic from the Chicago streets below. Arthur Hayes sat frozen in his chair, a man utterly destroyed. The reality of his situation crashed over him like a tidal wave of concrete. He had no job. He had no $2 million salary. Because he had been terminated for cause under a morality clause, his industry reputation in venture capital would be instantly radioactive. Worse still, based on the assumption of his new wealth, Arthur had recently signed a lease on a $12,000 a month penthouse. He had bought his new gold Rolex on credit. He had leased a brand new Mercedes for Chloe. He was millions of dollars in debt with absolutely zero income. David, Arthur whispered, grabbing his lawyer's sleeve. David, you have to fix this. Sue them for wrongful termination. Demand spousal support. She's a billionaire. She has to pay me alimony. David Caldwell calmly detached Arthur's trembling hand from his expensive suit. He slowly closed his file and clicked his pen shut. "Arthur," Caldwell said coldly, loud enough for the judge to hear, "I bill $800 an hour. You just lost your job, your assets are heavily leveraged, and you just admitted on the public record that you waived all rights to her company. You have no case, and more importantly, you have no money to pay me. I am withdrawing as your counsel." "You can't do that," Arthur shrieked. In the gallery, the sound of a heavy sigh broke the tension. Chloe stood up. The young fitness influencer looked at Arthur, her expression shifting from infatuation to deep, calculating disgust. "Wait," Chloe said, her high-pitched voice piercing the room. "So, you don't have the $2 million? You don't have the Kensington job?" Arthur turned back to her, his eyes pleading. "Chloe, baby, it's a setback. Just a minor legal hurdle. I'm still me. I'm still the man you love. We'll figure this out. We still have the Tulum trip next week." Chloe let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "Arthur, you leased my car in your name. If you don't have a job, they're going to repossess it. And I am not paying the rent on that penthouse." She slung her designer handbag over her shoulder. "I told you to settle quietly. You just had to show off. Chloe, please." Arthur begged, half standing from his chair. "Don't call me," she said flatly. Without another word, Chloe turned on her heels and walked out of courtroom 402, the heavy oak doors swinging shut behind her, finalizing Arthur's absolute isolation. Judge Campbell, who had watched the entire spectacle with a mixture of awe and grim satisfaction, cleared his throat. "Well," the judge said, adjusting his glasses, "this has certainly been an illuminating morning. Mr. Hayes, since you are now unrepresented and currently unemployed, we must finalize the matter of the settlement. Ms. Shaw, your client previously stated she was waiving all claims to spousal support from Mr. Hayes. Does that still stand?" "It does, Your Honor," Miranda replied with a sharp smile. "We want nothing from Mr. Hayes. Furthermore, we accept his generous documented offer of a clean break. No alimony in either direction. They both walk away with whatever assets are currently legally in their own names."
It's Omath.
Arthur looked at Penelope, tears of genuine panic finally welling in his eyes. The arrogance was completely stripped away, leaving only a terrified, broken man. "Penny," Arthur pleaded, his voice breaking. "Penny, please. 15 years. We built a life together. You know I have a heart condition when I get stressed. You can't just leave me with nothing. I'll be ruined. I'll have to declare bankruptcy. Penny, look at me." Penelope looked at him. She looked at the man who had called her a failure, who had mocked her body, who had sneered at her quiet dedication, and who had replaced her with a younger model the second he thought he had outgrown her. "You didn't build anything, Arthur," Penelope said, her voice resolute and unbothered. "You simply occupied the space I paid for. I spent a decade making myself small so you could feel like a giant. That I am done shrinking for you. You wanted a divorce. You wanted a clean break to live your luxurious new life. I'm simply giving you exactly what you asked for." She turned away from him, looking up at the bench. "We are ready for your ruling, Your Honor." Judge Campbell gave a firm, decisive nod. "Based on the post-nuptial agreement provided and the mutual waiver of spousal support, I hereby grant the dissolution of this marriage. The assets will remain cleanly divided as they are currently titled. Mr. Hayes, you are responsible for your own debts. This court is adjourned." The gavel banged, sealing Arthur's fate with a hollow wooden thud. Penelope didn't linger. She gathered her purse, thanking Miranda quietly. As she walked down the aisle toward the exit, Arthur remained slumped at his table, his face buried in his hands, quietly weeping as the reality of his new, destitute life settled over him. Penelope Hayes pushed open the heavy oak doors and stepped out into the hallway. She didn't look back. She walked out of the courthouse and into the bright Chicago morning, sliding into the back of a waiting black luxury town car. For the first time in 15 years, she felt incredibly light, ready to conquer the world she already owned. If you love this story of ultimate karma and watching absolute arrogance get dismantled in the courtroom, hit that like button right now. Share this video with anyone who needs a reminder that the loudest person in the room is rarely the strongest. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more real-life drama, shocking plot twists, and satisfying revenge stories every single week.